In this video lesson, we'll discuss the development of the railroad and the impact that it had on the growth of the United States. If you pause the video and look at the chart for a moment, you can see the figures about the railroads worldwide around the time of 1889. As government business entanglements continued to grow, they also undermined the industrial development of the country. The outburst of railroad construction was a crucial case. By 1900, the miles of railroad had spurted up to 192,000, much of which was west of the Mississippi River. Transcontinental railroad building was so costly and risky that it required government subsidies, which meant the government had to help fund it. The extension of rails into thinly populated regions was also very unprofitable. Private promoters were unwilling to suffer heavy initial losses, so Congress then began to advance money to favor the cross-continent companies in 1862. Land grants were given to railroads as well along that proposed route, and the railroads were allowed to choose alternate mile-square sections in checkerboard fashion, withholding, and basically the railroads then withheld all the other land from other users so that no one could build additional railroads where they were building. Noisy criticism was leveled at the giveaway of land to greedy corporations, but the government did receive beneficial returns and cheaper rates for service. Granting land was also a cheap way to subsidize a much-desired transportation because it avoided new taxes for direct cash grants, and critics overlooked the railroad's ability to give land a modest value after they had covered it with steel. Frontier villages touched by the magic wand of the iron rail became flourishing cities. Those that were bypassed often withered away and became ghost towns. Communities fought one another for the privilege of playing host to the railroads. Deadlock in the 1850s over the proposed transcontinental railroad, the railroad that would extend from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, was broken when the South seceded from the Union and left the North basically in control, and Congress began to make provisions for the Transcontinental Railroad at that time. One weighty argument for the action was the urgency of bolstering the Union by binding the Pacific Coast more securely to the rest of the Republic. The Union Pacific Railroad was thus commissioned by Congress to move westward from Omaha, Nebraska, and for each mile of track constructed, the company was granted 20 square miles of land and a generous federal loan ranging from $16,000 to $48,000. The laying of rails began in earnest after the Civil War ended in 1865, and with loans and land grants available, the promoters made all possible haste. Construction gangs containing many Irish paddies who had fought in the Union armies worked at a frantic pace. When hostile Indians attacked the futile efforts to protect what once rightfully had been their land, the laborers would drop their picks and seize guns to fight the Native Americans. Scores of men, railroad workers, and Indians lost their lives as the railroads continued to grow. At rail's end, workers tried their best to find relaxation in their tented towns, known as Hells on Wheels, often teeming with as many as 10,000 men and a sprinkling of painted prostitutes and performers to entertain them. Rail laying at the California end was undertaken by the Central Pacific Railroad. This line pushed boldly eastward from Sacramento over and through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Far-seeing men, the so-called Big Four, were the chief financial backers of the enterprise. They include the ex-governor Leland Stanford of California, who had useful political connections, and the burly Collis B. Huntington, who was a very adept loyalist. The Big Four operated through two construction companies, and they kept their hands relatively clean by not becoming involved in the bribery of congressmen. The Central Pacific Railroad, which was granted the same subsidies as the Union Pacific, had the same incentive to work quickly. Some 10,000 Chinese laborers proved to be cheap, efficient, and expendable labor, and the towering Sierra Nevada presented a formidable barrier. A wetting of the rails was finally consummated near Ogden, Utah in 1869 as two locomotives met. The Union built 1,086 miles and the Central Pacific built 689 miles of the Transcontinental Railroad. Completion of the Transcontinental Line was one of America's most impressive peacetime undertakings. It welded the West Coast firmly to the Union and facilitated a flourishing trade with Asia and increased a phenomenal growth of the Great West. With the Westward Trail now blazed, 4 other transcontinental lines were completed before the century's end, but none of them secured monetary loans from the federal government. All of them, except the Great Northern, received generous land grants of land. The Northern Pacific Railroad, which stretched from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, reached its terminus, which means its end, in 1883. The Topeka and Santa Fe, stretching through the southwestern deserts to California, was completed in 1884, and the Southern Pacific went from New Orleans to San Francisco and was consolidated in 1884. The last spike of the 5 transcontinental railroads of the 19th century was hammered home in 1893. The Great Northern, which ran from Duluth to Seattle, was the creation of a far-visioned Canadian American named James J. Hill. He perceived that the prosperity of his railroad depended on the prosperity of the area that it served. His enterprise was soundly organized and had no major problems. Too often, pioneer builders pushed into areas that lacked enough potential population to support a railroad, and sometimes laid rails that led from nowhere to nothing. Many of the large railroads in the post-Civil War decades passed through seemingly endless bankruptcies, mergers, or reorganizations because they trusted investors who let them down. The success of the Western lines was facilitated by welding together and expanding older Eastern networks, notably the New York Central. The genius of this compromise was Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, as he shifted from steamboating to railroading. Offering superior railway service at lower rates, he amassed a fortune of $100 million. His name is perhaps remembered through his contribution to Vanderbilt University. 2 significant new improvements provided a boom for the railroads as well. One was the steel raid, which Vanderbilt helped popularize when he replaced old iron tracks of the New York Central with the tougher metal. Steel was safer and more economical because it could bear a heavier load. This picture is actually the picture that shows the union of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific at Promontory Point, Utah, and the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. A standard gauge of track width came into wide use at this time, eliminating the expense and inconvenience of numerous changes from one line to another. In the very beginning, all the railroad companies built their lines different widths. Other refinements played a vital role in railroading. The Westinghouse air brake was a marvelous contribution to efficiency and safety. Pullman palace cars, advertised as gorgeous traveling hotels, were introduced on a considerable scale in the 1860s. Alarmists condemned them as wheeled torture chambers, though, and potential funeral pyres, for the wooden cars were equipped with swaying kerosene lamps. There were many accidents that continued to be almost daily tragedies, despite safety devices like the telegraph. For the first time, a sprawling nation became united with a physical sense, bound with ribs of iron and steel. By stitching North America together from ocean to ocean, the transcontinental lines created an enormous domestic market for American raw materials and manufactured goods, and became the largest national market area in the world. The huge empire of commerce beckoned the foreign and domestic investors alike. The railroad network spurred the amazing industrialization of the post-Civil War years. The locomotives opened up fresh markets for manufactured goods and sped raw materials to factories. The single largest order for the fawning steel industry was shipped by railroad. The screeching iron horse stimulated mining and agriculture, especially in the West, and it took farmers to their land, carried their products to the market, and brought items back to them. Railways were a boon for cities and played a leading role in the great citywide movement of the last decades of the century, bringing food, raw materials, and markets to the cities. Railroad companies also stimulated the mighty stream of immigration, seeking settlers advertised seductively in Europe and sometimes offered to transport the newcomers. The land also felt the impact of the railroad, especially the midsection of the continent. Settlers following the railroads in Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, and Nebraska planted well-drained rectangular cornfields on the prairies of the Dakotas and the Montana area. The white pine forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota began to disappear into lumber that was rushed by rail to prairie farmers to build houses and fences. Time itself was bent on the railroad's needs as well. Until the 1880s, every town in the United States had its own local time, which was dictated by the sun's position, even in the same time zones. For railroad operators worried about keeping schedules and avoiding wrecks, this local time was a nightmare. So on November 18, 1883, the major rail lines decreed that the continent would henceforth be divided into 4 time zones. And they can be seen here in this diagram. The railroad was the maker of millionaires. A raw new aristocracy consisting of lords of the rail replaced the other southern lords of the lash, and the colossal wealth that was amassed by stock speculators and railroad wreckers continued to increase. We'll discuss more about the impact of the railroads and how it changed the way Americans lived in our discussions in class.